Let's talk about a relationship dynamic that almost always flies under the radar until it's too late: the empath and the avoidant. Empaths are the givers, the feelers, the ones who always see the best in someone, especially when that someone keeps them at arm's length. They give understanding, they offer compassion, they extend patience, and they do it over and over again. Avoidants, on the other hand, are masters of emotional distance. They crave intimacy but fear the vulnerability it requires, so they dance close enough to keep the empath invested, but never close enough to truly connect. This dynamic can last a while, sometimes years. Why? Because empaths don't give up easily. They believe love can heal. They believe if they just love harder, softer, longer, something will change. But here's what the avoidant doesn't see coming. The empath gets tired. There's a moment, and it doesn't come with fireworks or screaming, when the empath goes quiet inside. Not out of hurt, but out of clarity. They've replayed the same emotional loop too many times. They've talked to themselves, talked to friends, journaled it, cried it out, and they finally reach a breaking point that looks a lot like peace. That's when the tables turn. When a fed-up empath pulls back, they don't do it to manipulate. They do it because they see clearly now. They see that their compassion became a cushion. Their patience became a permission slip. Their love was holding space for someone who wasn't ready to step into it. And here's the truth. Once an empath gets out of their head and into their self-worth, the avoidant loses their power. Because the empath's attention was never the problem. It was their absence that became the biggest mirror. So if you're the avoidant, know this: you never feared intimacy with the empath. You feared being truly seen by someone who wouldn't tolerate hiding forever. And if you're the empath, you are not too much. You are simply offering depth to someone who only knew how to swim in the shallow end. When you finally walk away, it's not revenge, it's revolution. And that is the real threat. Empaths are wired to feel deeply. They don't just hear words, they feel tone, energy, silence. They're attuned to the emotional undercurrents in a relationship, which makes them incredibly supportive and compassionate partners. When an avoidant partner starts to pull away, create distance, or shut down emotionally, the empath doesn't respond with frustration right away. Instead, they lean in. They assume the other person is hurting, afraid, overwhelmed, and they try to be even more patient, more loving, more forgiving. It makes the empath an incredibly stabilizing force in the relationship at first. They're often the ones who reach out after arguments, who smooth over miscommunications, who say, "I understand," even when they're the one left feeling unseen or unheard. And they do it because they believe love means holding space, being strong when the other person can't be. They think, if I can just love them enough, they'll eventually feel safe enough to open up, to stay, to commit. But that pattern is deceptive, because what looks like patience and strength in the short term often leads to emotional exhaustion in the long term. The empath is pouring energy into a connection that often isn't pouring anything back. They're constantly adjusting themselves to make the relationship work, questioning if they're being too much, too needy, too sensitive. When the reality is, they're asking for the bare minimum: emotional presence. What the avoidant partner often doesn't realize is that every time they pull away, every time they dismiss the empath's emotional bids, they're slowly burning through that empath's reserves. It may not look like it on the surface. Empaths tend to give benefit of the doubt for a long time, but internally, the empath is tracking everything. Every moment they feel invisible, every time they swallow their needs, every time they excuse the avoidant's inability to show up, and eventually they hit a wall. That wall doesn't come with a big outburst, it comes quietly, when the empath starts to realize they've been loving someone who keeps them at arm's length, that they've been the glue in a connection that requires both people to hold it together. And most importantly, they realize that all the giving, all the emotional labor hasn't changed anything. Yes, it feels like an emotional labor. hasn't changed anything. That's when the empathy, the patience, the trying stops. Because even someone who feels everything can only take so much before they decide they deserve more. Avoidants operate with a deep fear of emotional closeness, even if they don't always recognize it. They often crave connection on some level, but as soon as intimacy starts to deepen, they instinctively pull back. It's not always a conscious decision. It's a defense mechanism built over years of learning that closeness can mean pain, loss, or feeling trapped. So they keep others at a safe distance, not so far that the relationship ends, but not close enough for true vulnerability to take root. When paired with an empath, this dynamic becomes particularly charged. The empath offers emotional safety, deep understanding, and unconditional presence, exactly the kind of connection the avoidant both longs for and fears. At first, the avoidant may find this comforting. They might even feel relief, thinking they finally found someone who gets them, someone who's willing to carry more of the emotional load. But what they often fail to realize is that the empath's patience isn't limitless. Avoidants tend to assume that empaths will always be there. They mistake the empath's early willingness to overextend as permanence. Because the empath keeps showing up, forgiving, understanding, smoothing things over, the avoidant develops a false sense of security. They believe they can continue to avoid hard conversations, keep their emotional walls up, and the relationship will continue to function. But what they don't see is that the very dynamic they're leaning on is slowly collapsing. Each time the avoidant dismisses the empath's emotional needs or minimizes their concerns, a fracture forms. And while the empath may not voice their pain immediately, often internalizing it or rationalizing it, those wounds accumulate. Eventually, what the avoidant counted on as a stable, dependable presence begins to shift. The greatest miscalculation the avoidant makes is underestimating when that shift will come. They assume that because the empath has always stayed, they always will. But when the empath finally reaches their limit, they don't just pull back, they shut the door quietly and for good. That's when the avoidant is truly threatened, because they've built their sense of power and control on the idea that the empath will keep tolerating the distance. When that's gone, the avoidant is left exposed, faced with their own emotional avoidance and the consequences of what they never thought they'd lose. The moment everything changes between an empath and an avoidant isn't loud. It doesn't usually come during a dramatic fight or some emotional showdown. It comes in silence. Not the kind of silence filled with tension or passive aggression, but a deep, still quiet. The kind that means the empath has stopped hoping, stopped explaining, stopped trying to reach someone who never really tried to meet them halfway. This silence is misunderstood by the avoidant. At first, they may even feel relief. The calls have stopped. The emotional check-ins are gone. The pressure to talk, to explain, to connect, all of it fades, and they assume the empath is simply giving them more space. In fact, they might think the situation is improving, but what's actually happening is that the empath has shifted internally. They've gone from being emotionally invested to emotionally unavailable. Not out of pettiness, but out of clarity. This clarity isn't born overnight. It's the product of countless moments where the empath felt dismissed, overlooked, or emotionally neglected. They've expressed themselves only to be met with defensiveness or indifference. They've reached for intimacy and been met with walls. So finally, they stop reaching. They don't do it with a grudge. They do it because their emotional energy has been stretched to its limit and something inside them quietly breaks. That breaking doesn't look like chaos. It looks like a decision to redirect their attention from the avoidant to themselves. A decision to stop trying to decode mixed signals. A decision to stop carrying the emotional weight of two people. And that moment of silence, that internal shift, is when the power dynamic flips. The avoidant, who once held the upper hand by keeping connection just out of reach, now feels something missing. They can't feel the empath's emotional presence anymore. They're no longer being pursued or soothed. The usual dance, the push and pull, is disrupted. And with that, the avoidant starts to feel a sense of uncertainty they're not used to, the fear of real loss. Because when the empath is fully present, they offer deep emotional richness. But when they go quiet, when they truly check out, they don't play games. They don't withdraw to get attention. They withdraw because they've accepted the truth. This person cannot or will not meet them where they are. And once that silence sets in, it's no longer a pause. It's an ending that already began. When an empath finally walks away or emotionally checks out of a relationship with an avoidant, what speaks the loudest isn't a confrontation. It's their absence. The silence, the lack of messages, the missing emotional presence that was once always there. That becomes deafening. For so long, the empath's love, support, and emotional availability acted as a constant buffer. The avoidant could pull back, disappear, or resist vulnerability, but still feel connected, still feel wanted, because the empath was always there, filling the space between them. But the moment the empath removes themselves from that space, the avoidant is forced to sit with the very emptiness they've worked so hard to avoid. It's not the empath's words that hit hardest. It's the sudden disappearance of everything they had taken for granted. Here, the avoidant doesn't just lose a partner, they lose a mirror that constantly reflected understanding, safety, and acceptance. This is the moment of reckoning for the avoidant, because as long as the empath was there, they never had to face the full consequences of their emotional unavailability. They could stay at a distance and still enjoy the benefits of connection, but when that connection is gone, they're confronted with their own emotional void. They start to realize that all those little moments, the empath checking in, offering comfort, trying to talk things through, were not just niceties. They were the lifeblood of the relationship. What's often misunderstood is that empaths don't walk away lightly. Their absence isn't a reaction. It's the result of exhaustion. It's not meant to provoke guilt or get attention. It's simply the result of giving too much for too long without receiving enough in return. The empath's silence isn't designed to punish. It's the sound of boundaries finally being enforced. For the avoidant, this loss hits harder than expected, not because they suddenly become someone they're not, but because the emotional safety net they never thought would disappear has. They may try to re-engage the empath in familiar ways, but it often doesn't work. Not because the empath is being cruel, but because they've already detached emotionally. And once the empath detaches, the depth they once offered becomes unavailable. The avoidant is left to sit with the very thing they were trying to avoid all along, true emotional exposure, without anyone there to shield them from it. That absence becomes the loudest message of all, louder than any words the empath could have said. When an empath finally walks away from an avoidant, it's not out of bitterness, spite, or a desire to hurt the other person. It's not an act of revenge. It's an act of self-respect, often the first real one they've made in a relationship where they've spent more time protecting someone else's comfort than honoring their own needs. The empath isn't trying to prove a point. They're simply reclaiming something they've lost along the way. Themselves. Throughout the relationship, the empath likely bent over backwards to understand the avoidant's behavior. They rationalized distance, excused coldness, and minimized their own needs in the hope that one day the avoidant would feel safe enough to truly show up. They operated from love, not weakness. But love given without reciprocation slowly becomes self-abandonment, and the empath over time begins to see that. What's powerful and threatening about a fed-up empath is that they don't just leave the relationship, they leave the dynamic. They no longer participate in the pattern of emotional overgiving. They no longer define love by how much they can tolerate or how deeply they can empathize with someone else's wounds while ignoring their own. This shift is seismic because it's not about punishing the avoidant, it's about healing themselves. The avoidant often doesn't expect this kind of departure. They assume the empath's loyalty is endless because it has been until it isn't. And once the empath reclaims their energy, their focus, and their emotional investment, something irreversible happens. They stop chasing potential. They stop romanticizing fragments of affection. They stop negotiating for love that should have been given freely. That's the true threat to the avoidant. Not anger, not confrontation, but the empath's evolution. The moment the empath recognizes their worth and detaches from the cycle, they're no longer manageable. They can't be pulled back in with breadcrumbs of affection or vague promises. They've outgrown the role of the emotional caretaker and stepped into the role of their own protector. The empath doesn't become hard, they become whole. And in doing so, they strip the avoidant of the dynamic that once kept them in control. Where there used to be someone willing to carry the emotional weight for two, there is now only someone walking away. Not to hurt, but to heal. That's what makes the fed-up empath the greatest threat. They finally stop giving everything to someone who gave them just enough to stay and choose to give everything to themselves instead. And so, if you've ever been the empath, the one who stayed too long, gave too much, and hoped too hard, know this. Your empathy was never the problem. Your depth was never a flaw. What made you feel small in the wrong relationship will be the very thing that makes you feel powerful in the right one. And if you're the avoidant, it's time to recognize that emotional safety isn't created by distance, it's created by showing up. The very person you kept at arm's length might have been the only one willing to love you fully. But even an open heart can close when it's been ignored for too long. Because in the end, it's not the person who cries the loudest that changes the story. It's the one who goes quiet, walks away, and never looks back. It's a fed-up empath doesn't burn bridges. They build new ones that lead straight back to themselves. Thank you for listening. Take care of your heart. And more importantly, protect the ones who've been protecting you all along. Goodbye for now, and thank you.